So the other day I was coaching a teacher, a client of mine, and we had this very long conversation about characterization and the STEAL method, or the STEAL acronym, whatever you want to call it. And what we kind of came to terms with was it's not always helpful. And we were kind of trying to figure out why and like what about this acronym is not always serving students. So to be clear, I am a huge fan of acronyms. I think that they're incredibly powerful, and I really think that they can change the game for students in terms of scaffolding. I think about the power of Space Cat with my AP Lang students. I think about Stopestone before that. Those have been really, really good. But then I also think about my experience as a student in high school, and I remember learning TP Cast with poetry. And I can remember TP Cast feeling like such a hindrance for me to not only enjoying poetry, but really to understand what my job was as someone who was analyzing poetry. And it just wasn't the right one. And I think that that's something that we need to keep in mind when we have these tools, especially when they come to acronyms, is the acronym convenient, or is the acronym serving the actual goal, which is scaffolding learning? Is it actually helping students get from observation to analysis? We are here today and we are going to start looking at characterization, which is like the number one most requested close reading tool and advice that people ask me about. And so I'm definitely going to cover it. I'm glad we've talked about other things in this series. This is video 5 in our series about close reading texts as supplementals, right? So we have a core unit on one text and we want to bring in a supplemental. A lot of times we bring in a podcast or a TED Talk or something else that's more connected to the big ideas of the unit. I make resources about that all the time, and I think that's incredibly powerful and effective too. But if you're in the position where you're trying to really work on analysis and deepening your students' skills in looking at author's craft or author's style or a speaker's craft or a speaker's style, I'm finding more and more that pairing texts together by device or by craft tool has been incredibly game-changing for students. So when it comes to characterization, I think that STEAL might be a place you could start, right? Like if you wanted to, so for those of you who don't know what I'm talking about, STEAL is an acronym that stands for speech, thoughts, effects on others, actions, and looks, right? They're all different ways that a character is indirectly characterized. Could I put two passages side by side that describe a physical appearance of a character? Sure. Could we find some depth there? Maybe. Could I put two passages side by side where I'm asking them to look at the effect on others? Sure. I think that that's possible. I'm struggling though, and this goes back to this conversation I had with this teacher, is I feel like these things that we look at, right? Speech, thoughts, effects on others, actions, and looks, kids still need to go a couple more steps. I don't know how much closer it gets them to analysis. It maybe gets them closer to observations, but I don't know how much closer it gets them to analysis, right? So if we're going to look at effect on others, kids would say, oh, the effect on others is this. The effect on others is this, right? The way that this is described, the way that so-and-so affects others, like that's, now we understand that about his characterization. It kind of feels like there's a period at the end of that sentence. And I don't think that we want that, right? Not here in this moment and what we're focusing on. And so what I've done with characterization is I kind of ditched the acronym. So I want to give you permission to do the same. If it serves you, if it's working, don't ditch it, keep using it, please. But if the acronym's not really serving you, maybe just go with what's there. What's in front of you? What are you actually observing about the characterization happening in that novel, in this passage, in the moment that you want to close read and you want students to actually get better at critical thinking and doing their analysis? So for me, one of the ways that I have noticed in the works that I've studied and taught to students is that a lot of times characterization comes through as characters have flashbacks and memories. And this, what I love about this, I feel like I hit the jackpot on this one, is that it's an author's craft tool, right? Authors use flashback. They use the interruption of the present in order to share a memory. This is an author's craft tool. But it's used in these situations, and there could be other reasons too, but in these scenarios, a flashback or a memory is used to deepen or reveal something about the characterization of this character that we maybe didn't know before, or that explains something that we already do know and now we know why. There are lots of reasons that we can now attach a stylistic choice to characterization. And that is where we want the period to go at the end of that sentence, right? Like I want students to be able to write the sentence, right? The author uses flashback. Tell me about the flashback, right? What is presented, what's there, what's in that moment. And then in order to something about the character. That's where I want my students thinking to be. So when I talk about the acronym, think about the longer term, like what does that actually look like in terms of sentences and paragraphs and analysis? I hope that makes sense. And I want to show you this example today. We are going to look, again, I don't have my book. Again, I use this book all the time. We are going to look at the novel Legend by Marie Lu. And what you need to know about Legend is that Legend is a stunning dystopian novel. I love using this in a dystopian lit circle. I love using this all by itself. And we have dual narrators. We have a protagonist who's kind of grown up within the dystopia. She's on track to become part of the leadership in this dystopian regime, and is kind of bought into the corruption in that it's serving the greater good. She's got her head wrapped around this. And then, of course, she's sent on some missions to do some things where she meets the other character. Her name is June. The other character's name is Day. She interacts with Day and starts to kind of see the other side, see the way that others live. And the two of them are matched in their talent and their prowess and their intelligence. They've definitely got an enemies to lover trope going on. And really, it's just a cool look at how these two worlds impact, right? Like the world of Day impacts the understanding and the worldview of June all throughout the novels, right? So like he is the reason that her character is complex and her character kind of shifts and morphs over the course of the text. But one of the things that Marie Lu uses frequently in this text is flashback and memories. And I think about Fahrenheit does this as well. Montag does. They're not really drawn out, but Montag has a lot of like thought interruption moments where there are flashbacks or vague memories of life before meeting Clarice. And so those are really cool things that I think would be awesome to look at in terms of characterization. So that's the goal today is to look at how do flashbacks and memories reveal something new or confirm something that we weren't quite sure about with this character. Ultimately, the standard we're focusing on is complex characterization over the course of a text. And I really love this one too, because we can visit it over and over and over again because the complexity of that character is changing as we keep reading throughout the story. So let's jump in and take a look at the text. So let's take a look at how two things are working together in order to develop characterization. In this passage, we are focusing on, I'd say, probably the height of conflict. I'd say that this is probably the climax of this novel. And again, what's so cool about this scene is you can give as much context or as little context as you need to, but students will be able to pick up on a lot from just what's here. There's going to be so much to easily infer about the characterization, even though they haven't been reading this novel in its entirety. They're going to be just fine. And so I thought I'd take you through this one a little bit more like I would do it in a lesson. Well, I could say one version of that, right? There are so many different ways we could do it. But this is kind of how I would do it with my students. So we would, of course, right, begin with looking at the directions, the things that we're highlighting. And I would tell my students, don't highlight anything on our first read. We're just going to read. And so that first read, I could have my students read silently on their own. I could have them read in pairs and alternating paragraphs. We could do a popcorn read. We could listen to it if I have the audiobook. But the first read is all hands and all pens and all highlighters down. Just listening, just being in the story. This is not always advisable if the passage is kind of long, but in this case, it's totally doable. On the second read, which is what we're going to do, I'm going to pretend like you all came here and read this once already. We're going to do the second read, which is going to be all together. And on the second read, we're only going to look for blue. We're going to go one bullet point at a time. So on this read, we're just going to look for explicit emotions identified by June. Then on the third read through, we're going to look for the second bullet point, which is where is the memory and where is the flashback. Now, what you're probably going to notice when we do this is that the passage is not that challenging. Finding these two things is going to be pretty easy for us. But if we think about this as a student and as students who are learning to close read and learning to pay attention to things that they normally don't, it's really smart to read the passage as many times as possible. That's going to be, this is, right, this is the place where equity is, right? This is the home of where our reading instruction equity comes into play. We are giving direct modeling experience, right? Advice and showing students through this process, no matter how good of a reader they are independently or how much they've done on their own or how much they've kept up to your reading calendar. Here is the moment where we are actually teaching reading and what can be found in the things that students see. So take your time. There's no need to rush. So let's read through it and we're going to look for explicit emotion. I've taken advantage of Day's greatest weakness. He doesn't hesitate, doesn't stop to question what I say, doesn't even wonder why I didn't tell him right away. Instead, he leaps to his feet, pinpoints the direction that sirens are coming from, and darts out of the alley. I feel a surprising pang of guilt. Ooh, there's our first explicit emotion. And we're going to highlight it in blue. I think one of the things I would stop to talk to students about would be this word here, surprising. We know that the word guilt is the emotion, but the fact that the main character is surprised by it is notable. And then we can kind of backwards, look back at the scene of what just happened. We know that she's taken advantage of another person. And not just taken advantage of him, but taken advantage of his greatest weakness. We don't know exactly what happened, but we know that she did it, and now she's kind of regretting it. And so she kind of we continue. So June is her name. June continues. She says, "He trusts me, truly, stupidly, wholeheartedly trusts me. In fact, I don't know if anyone has ever taken my word so readily before. Maybe not even Matthias." That's her brother. Tess watches him go with a look of increasing fright. "Come on, let's follow him," Tess exclaims. She jumps to her feet and takes my hands. "He might need our help." "No," I snap. "You wait here. I'll follow him. Keep low and stay quiet. Someone will come back for you." I don't bother to wait for Tess. If it matters to you, Tess is Day's sister. So the boy who was just he was spooked by the sirens and ran. This is his sister who wants to chase after him. But June says, "I don't bother to wait for Tess's reply before I take off down the street. When I look over my shoulder, I see Tess standing in the alley with her wide eyes locked on my vanishing figure. I turn back around. Best to keep her out of this. If we arrest Day today, what will happen to her?" I click my tongue and turn on my mic. Okay, so this is not an explicit emotion. But I do feel like this is residual of that guilt, right? She's questioning the consequences of what she's just done. And so again, this will be kind of interesting to ask students, does this count as a continuation of her guilt? I think it does. Because they're about to go arrest, capture this guy, and this is the sister. What's going to happen to her? Those have got to be related. But she keeps moving, right? So she thinks about it. She thinks about it here, and then she thinks about it here, but she keeps moving. I click my tongue and turn on my mic. Static blares for a second in my tiny earpiece. Then I hear Thomas's voice. Talk to me, he says. What's going on? Where are you? Day's headed toward Figueroa and Watson right now. I'm on his tail. Thomas sucks in his breath. Right. We've already deployed. See you in a few. Wait for my word. No one is to be harmed, I start to say, but the static cuts off. Do we think maybe this is a little bit of her guilt talking too? I know we don't have a lot of other context. I'm just gonna, because we're talking here, highlight this. And I still feel like, right, like this character just did something atrocious, right? Like she just basically called the cops on her friend. But now she's trying to like go back on it and like make sure all these other things are taken care of when she could have just not called the cops in the first place. So I feel like her guilt is showing through pretty clearly. There's also this great foreshadowing of I start to say, but the static cuts off. I sprint down the street, my wound throbbing in protest. Day couldn't have gone far. He has less than a half-minute lead on me. I point myself in the direction that I remember Day going the previous night, south toward Union Station. Sure enough, before long, I see glimpses of Day's old cap peeking out far ahead of me in the crowd. All of my anger and fear and anxiety now zero in on the back of his head. I have to force myself to keep enough distance between us so that he doesn't know I'm following him. Okay, so here's some more explicit emotion, right? All my anger and fear and anxiety. She's got a lot going on right here. I have to force myself to keep enough distance between us so that he doesn't know I'm following him. A part of me recalls the way he saved me from the skiz fight, that he helped me heal this burning wound in my side, that his hands had been so gentle. I want to scream at him. I want to hate him for confusing me so much. Stupid boy. It's a wonder you've evaded the government for so long, but you can't hide now, not when your own family or friends are at risk. I have no sympathy for a criminal, I remind myself harshly. Just a score to settle. Ooh, okay. Could we also highlight here, right? Even though it's not what she's feeling, or she doesn't actually hate him, but she wants to hate him so badly. Stupid boy, it's a wonder you've evaded the government for so long. That's so good. Okay, so in this case, we would kind of go back. I would take students over here to this box and start to debrief, right? Just focusing on the emotions. Yes, I know that the memory is pretty obvious to see, but I don't want to analyze that just yet. Kind of like we talked about in the We Are Also Good at Smiling, how we kind of isolated the three different devices. They're not really that different from each other, but when we can isolate these things that we're highlighting, we're not only teaching students how to think through what they've read in a very broad sense, but also we can really hone in on what do explicit emotions do for us for characterization, right? So the guilt, right? If we did identify this guilt being in 1, 2, 3 places, it's fascinating to me about her character that by the end of the passage, she's erased all that guilt. So what does that say about June, right? That like she can feel guilt. She has all of these other surprising emotions. She wants to hate him. I think we can infer from this passage, and I would take longer to do this with students, but we can infer that she has feelings for this person, for Day. And so I think we can also infer from this passage that she's unaccustomed to having feelings for other people, that she must have been much more of a lone wolf kind of a personality, maybe never fallen in love, maybe never had anybody about her in her life that she deeply cared about other than maybe her brother. And so even though this guilt is a new, surprising feeling, she's still so hardwired to move forward, stick to the mission, right? Remember that she's got a score to settle. At this point in her characterization, at this point in her story, guilt is not a strong enough emotion to change her actions, right? That's the kind of conversation I want to have with students right here in this box and in this experience. Then we would go back and say, okay, what's the next thing we want to look at for students to learn about the characterization of June? Okay, so we're going to find the moment where the author uses a memory. Maybe we don't have to reread the whole thing. Maybe we do, but we're going to go down and find the memory right over here. It is a part of me recalls, and we teach that verb, right? The verb recall is to call back. That's how we are signaled that there's a flashback here. So here is that moment. A part of me recalls the way he saved me from the skiz fight, that he had helped me heal this burning wound in my side, and that his hands had been so gentle. So she has this flashback, this memory of Day who has saved her, healed her, and been gentle with her. That's a really loaded, stacked, positive flashback that she's having about the person that she's just framed. Again, right? That's kind of what triggers her reminder that she can't think this way and that she has to stick to her goals and her mission. And she's part of this government mission to track this kid down. And even though these really strong emotions are here in her flashback, same thing. So between guilt and the flashback are both really powerful, but neither one is powerful enough to stop her from what she's about to do or what she's already done or to change course. So that would lead us to some really cool conversations with whatever other text we're pairing and asking students to think about what emotions are strong enough to change human behavior, what emotions are strong enough to change people completely, or can our characters never fully change? I think about I'm thinking about Montag right now in Fahrenheit 451. He's one of the characters that I think is such a beautiful example of like a 180-degree change. But it was slow. It was over time, and definitely at I'd say the climax, he was ready to finally rebel and push back, but he hadn't fully shifted over yet. There were lots of moments very similar to what June's going through where he was battling his emotions still. And I think when characters are in the process of change, they're battling the new emotions that they're feeling in contest with the way that they've been raised or what they've always believed up until this point. So there's plenty there to talk about in a very simple, engaging, and interesting passage. I love that maybe this passage would also pique student interest in reading this novel. Legend could definitely and should be definitely taught on its own. It's so good as a dystopian choice. And then we didn't really look at the writing task because I wanted to show you something different. But the writing task is I gave you two versions. The first question could be, how does the author use both emotions and memories in order to demonstrate the evolving complexities of June's character? That's exactly what we just debriefed. To dig deeper, we could attach that conversation around the genre. If you're using this like in as a genre supplement, we could ask, how does the author use both emotions and memories in order to demonstrate the evolving complexities of June's character within her dystopian world? Right? Like so much of what June's going through and what we described earlier, that the indoctrination that she's feeling, the commitment she's feeling to her plan and the government, right? She is a pawn of the dystopian controlled government. So she is fully bought in, she's fully conformed to what the government wants, whereas Day is actually the rebel. And she's starting to see through him, which we don't really see in this passage, but we're starting to see through him that maybe what she's known her whole life is wrong. And it's actually not just, it's not the way that things should be. And that would contribute deeply to her confusion and right her anger and all these feelings that are mixing together and she doesn't know what to do with. So that would be where we end this lesson. I hope that this gave you some inspiration and some excitement to have one more passage to pair either in just talking about characterization or to develop a characterization and dystopian world conversation with your students. And we will see you again in another training. Bye bye.